A lively start to Sunday on BBC One. Big questions on medical ethics and Brexit with Nikki Campbell in Brighton in an hour after Andrew Marr.
Good morning to you. As we shiver our way through more Siberian weather, this weekend our relationship with Russia is going through a truly dangerous phase. It isn't just the alleged assassinations, it's also about the strength of our alliances and Britain's standing in the world. Or, to put it bluntly, in 2018, do the Russians care about how angry Britain gets? Well, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, is with us to talk about that Russian crisis and just possibly one or two other issues of moment. And I've been talking to one of the most senior Russian diplomats, Vladimir Putin's ambassador to the EU, Vladimir Chitschov. And in a week when Labour's been sharply divided about its response to the Salisbury attack, Jeremy Corbyn's Shadow Attorney General, Baroness Shami Chakrabarti. So, a mildly frantic hour ahead, but before we get stuck into those conversations, reviewing the news this weekend, The Guardian columnist Owen Jones and Jane Moore from The Sun. First, however, the news with Christian Fraser.
Good morning. The Russian ambassador to the EU, Vladimir Chitschov, has suggested that the UK's own research laboratory in Wiltshire could be the source of the nerve agent used in the poisoning of a former Russian spy in Salisbury. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Robbins.
2 weeks after the chemical attack on Sergei and Yulia Skripal, Ambassador Chitschov said there were no stockpiles whatsoever of nerve agents left in Russia. But then, in an interview with Andrew Marr, he went a bit further. Asked how the chemical weapon came to be used in Salisbury, Mr. Chitschov suggested,
when you have a nerve agent or whatever, you check it against certain samples that you retain in your laboratories. And Porton Down, as we now all know, is the largest military facility in the United Kingdom that has been dealing with chemical weapons research. And it's actually only 8 miles from Salisbury.
You're not suggesting that Porton Down is responsible for this nerve agent?
I don't know. I don't have any evidence of anything having been used.
As Britain continues to investigate the chemical attack, the Foreign Office dismissed this latest Russian account as absolute nonsense, with not an ounce of truth in it. A spokesperson said, it's just another futile attempt from the Russian state to divert the story away from the facts, that Russia has acted in flagrant breach of its international obligations. James Robbins, BBC News.
And you can see the full interview with Vladimir Chitschov later in this programme. Meanwhile, the Foreign Secretary has described Russia's closure of the British Consul and Consulate in St Petersburg as futile. Writing in The Sun on Sunday, Boris Johnson says the move will punish ordinary Russians by depriving them of opportunities to learn English. The closures were part of Russia's retaliation to sanctions imposed by the UK. And voting in Russia's presidential election is taking place across the country today, with Vladimir Putin set to secure a 4th term in office. Mr. Putin, who voted this morning in Moscow, has run the country as president or prime minister since 1999. 7 candidates are standing against him, but polls place his nearest rival on just 7% of the vote. Results are expected this evening. Snow and ice are causing difficult conditions in parts of the UK after a new cold snap dubbed the mini beast from the east. Parts of eastern England and Scotland have already had snow, with more expected in the Midlands and Wales. Amber warnings have been issued for northwest England, Yorkshire, the Midlands, London and southeast England from the afternoon. People are being advised to avoid travelling unless they have to. A group of MPs says the government should consider delaying the date for leaving the EU if complex issues remain unresolved. The Commons exiting the EU committee also suggests the transition period should be extended if no agreement is reached by October. However, 8 pro-Brexit MPs on the committee have refused to back the report. That's all from me. The next news on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Many thanks for that. Now then, front pages, one story dominating above all. There's the Mail on Sunday. Prime Minister's war on Putin, McMafia millions. Very similar story on the front page of the Sunday Express this week. May stands up to Putin, it says. The Sunday Telegraph, Britain to punish Putin's cronies. But what will Putin do about all of this? The Sunday Times has a rather alarming story, blackout threat for Britain as Putin hits back, they suggest. We'll be talking about that more later on. And then a story, rather complicated story on the front page of The Observer about Cambridge Analytica, which was the company involved in the Brexit referendum campaign, apparently harvesting data, breaching rules from Facebook. We'll do our best to explain that to you during the course of our review, but we're going to start off with the Sunday Times. Jane.
Yeah. I mean, this is all very complex stuff, but the water cooler conversations I've been hearing all week are people panicking about Russia cutting off our gas. And here we have Sunday Times blackout threat, and it says that the national grid was put on alert last week by spy chiefs saying that this may happen and that we have to prepare for it, which is alarming stuff in terms of this then, you know...
And it shows the dangers of the sort of tit-for-tat escalation. So we kick out 23, they kick out 23 and get rid of the British Council.
But, I mean,
so we do something else, so they do something else.
Whether or not this happens, again, in terms of if there's anything we're going to learn from this ever-evolving story is more money into defence, hopefully, but also into energy policies so that we are not over an oil barrel or whatever.
Absolutely. And this is not, to be clear, because we get lots and lots of gas from Russia. This is more because Russian cyber attacks could close down big chunks of our infrastructure, it is feared. Oh, and your first story.
So this is in the Times. Fascinating story about Russian oligarchs in London explaining that their businesses remain in Russia, they're not permanently residing in the UK, their mansions and palaces are owned by offshore companies, many are non-doms, pay very little in tax. Very parasitical, basically. It's not like they're contributing to a thriving, booming London economy.
That's The Observer.
Sorry, it is The Observer. I apologise to my sister paper as well.
Exactly. You'll be in trouble. I just wanted to suggest, I mean, anyone who's been watching McMafia understands the dangers of kind of dirty money washing through London. The question is what can be done about it, because you have to target the right people, not just anyone with a Russian name.
Absolutely, and that's why what the Conservatives are doing is talking tougher in rhetoric, but there's light years away in terms of the substance, because the so-called Magnitsky Amendment, modelled on what happened in America to tackle dirty money, what they're suggesting is actually a very watered-down version. So what Labour are suggesting instead, which I think is very wise, is instead, for example, to have an oligarch levy, which would raise about £1 billion up to every single year, which would target mansions bought by offshore trusts, which are, you know, all over London. I think the point I'd make here is, if we want an effective response, because these are oligarchs linked to a gangster regime in Russia, many of them, they looted the assets of that country, often with Western-backed economic policies and advisors, I should say, but then we need to get them where it hurts. And that isn't doing this theatrical kick out a diplomat here. Very
money.
Good for the Russian election. Should we have a sweepstake on the result of the Russian election, by the way? But no, I mean, it's all theatre. What would actually get the Russian regime is to go for those economic centres. And I have to say, it's interesting, isn't it? You get these conspiracy theories constantly about the Labour leadership being linked to foreign powers. They're actually demanding far tougher action on Russia and its oligarchs by going for these economic assets than the Tories are, and that may well be because the Tories, of course, are awash with hundreds of thousands of pounds.
And should we be going for economic
money.
assets purely based on the fact that we're in this, you know, argument with Russia, or should we be rolling it out for all dirty money? Because, of course, it's not just Russians that have dirty money going through London.
It's the right thing to do. It is, I think, something we should be pretty ashamed of, that our capital city, a great capital city, is the epicentre of so much money laundering and dirty money for many dubious regimes. These people are not moving here because they like the West End or they like the weather. They're coming here because we have a regime that encourages that sort of money. And the Tories, I'm afraid, are so linked to the City of London, they're not taking it on.
I mean, it was happening under Blair as well.
Very
there was
much
a lot
so.
of dirty money here.
Okay.
But I don't think anyone could compare this Labour Party to that Labour Party.
Let's move on, because there's two things I want to talk about. Boris Johnson, who's on the show later on, has written in The Sun.
He's written in The Sun on Sunday. Unsurprisingly, well, he's paid tribute to the many Labour MPs who have condemned Putin, but unsurprisingly, he's picked out Jeremy Corbyn as the only person refusing to join this show of solidarity, and how disappointed he is.
But it's quite interesting who's defending Jeremy Corbyn.
Exactly. Peter Hitchens, no less, has come out for Jeremy Corbyn, and he's saying, actually, Jeremy Corbyn, the treatment by many politicians and those in the media is disgraceful, because he's doing what he's paid to do, which is to lead the opposition. He's the leader of the opposition.
It's a very powerfully written piece,
and he says that he has a better record on foreign policy than almost anyone in Parliament.
Which is true. On Libya, for example, one of only about 13 MPs who voted against the catastrophe. Anyone who spoke out at the time was seen as a Gaddafi stooge. But also, I do think the point he's making is a very, very important one. If you look at Russia, what does the Putin regime do when it talks about opposition leaders? They're foreign linked, they're foreign stooges, they're linked to international terrorists.
They depend on a kind of paranoia.
But that's the sort of culture that's been imported into this country, because increasingly what you have in this country, where the enemies of the people is splashed on the front pages of newspapers, crush the saboteurs, where the leader of the opposition is smeared as a terrorist sympathising and the stooge of foreign regimes, is to delegitimise the opposition in the way the likes of Putin does. I think it's sinister. You don't have to like...
The likes of Putin shoot them in the streets.
Of course, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying the culture of treating your opponents as traitors and treasonous is sinister and dangerous, and all right-minded people should take it on.
He does point out also that he doesn't support him in sucking up to Sinn Féin, I should point out.
And in terms of what we should be doing in this country, Ruth Davidson, the Conservative, has broken ranks this morning and suggested, I think in the Sunday Telegraph, that the piece, that we should actually close down Russia Today because it's a propaganda mouthpiece.
Well, look, I mean, Russia Today, last time they stuck the camera in my face, I just said solidarity with LGBT people in Russia. I think it's obviously a propaganda station. Closing it down would be a PR gift, I think, for the Russian regime. They're clamping down on our press. They say they believe in the free press.
Because it's kind of, if we know it's a propaganda station, then that sort of actually, you know, takes away its power, doesn't
Exactly.
it?
And I do think the real questions to put to the Tories, if they want to take action, is, will you stop taking Russian-linked money? It's a very simple question. Another question is, for example, Theresa May kiboshed an inquiry into Litvinenko's poisoning of many years ago, year after year, because she said it had upset diplomatic relations with Russia, i.e. upset Putin. Why did she do that? Did it embolden her? I hope Boris Johnson's asked later.
Marina Litvinenko, his widow, was on the show last week, was very, very upset. But it took her a very long time to get the public inquiry up and running, and then afterwards she felt the actions taken weren't nearly tough enough. So obviously, now let's move on to another similar story. It's a double agent.
This fascinates me because you sort of think that maybe, you know, probably watched too many James Bond movies, but you kind of think that the upside of being a spy is that you drive around in an Aston Martin and live in a very large house, the spoils of all your work. But no, we know from what we're reading is a lot of these guys kind of live in relative anonymity in a little terraced house somewhere. And there's this guy here, Russian defector Viktor Makarov. He's saying he lives in fear of his life. He's a KGB defector. He's got holes in his shoes. He's living in complete poverty. And the reporter here, David Collins, is saying he's been abandoned by Britain. And you do wonder, that's sort of part of the problem, isn't it? You know, that these guys are vulnerable to attack because we have just said, well, thanks very much for what you did. Now get on with your life with no security, no money, no nothing.
Yeah. You could argue that from Putin's point of view, he has got everything he wants. In other words, he's got a big crisis just ahead of the elections to maximise the turnout, and at the same time, he has sent exactly the message he wants to send to all ex-KGB or FSB defectors. You will be killed.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think my fear with the diplomatic ratcheting thing is it doesn't cause any harm to the regime. It's good propaganda, which is why the economic assets, I think, going for the oligarchs is far wiser.
It makes him look more powerful in his own country.
My friends, the time has come. We're going to try and explain the Cambridge Analytica story.
Right, so this is in the Observer. Thank you.
Over to you.
Lovely stuff. Look, this is a quite interesting story about the harvesting, basically, of data and doing detailed data profiling of voters and so on. And it's been linked to what's happened in terms of Donald Trump's victory, but also with Brexit. My concern about it sometimes is it gets a bit conspiratorial sometimes about why, you know, I voted and campaigned for Remain, but we didn't really lose the referendum. It was all dirty tricks. It must have been
some kind of dodgy cheat.
It was, but I would say what the real important thing is about data and about data protection. And I think that's what we need very clear laws, I think, in this country and elsewhere, that our data should be publicly owned. It should not be harvested by private companies and used in devious ways. And I think that's definitely the lesson. OK, let's salute Ben Parkinson.
Yes. Talking about spies not being looked after, here is Ben Parkinson, who was, you know, catastrophically injured, actually. And this is the mark of modern warfare, actually, now, that these guys are surviving, whereas, of course, in the old days, he would not have survived. And you would think that it would be absolutely a tick box for this country to look after people like Ben Parkinson, but he is having to sue the Army or the MOD.
There's a suggestion he's going to lose his wheelchair.
Yeah, I mean, he just is not being given the right amount of support and financing to sustain his life as it is now. Now, charities like Help for Heroes obviously would help him, but actually, as a country, we should help him.
The government sends these brave people off to fight often in you know, wars, terrible wars, and you get examples of benefits being cut off soldiers. It's just
an awful, I think we can all agree on that. It's an awful story. Thank you both very much indeed for the paper review. And so to the weather, well, this is completely absurd. It's the middle of March, it feels like December, and it's been snowing again. Something should be done. Where is national leadership when you need it? With all the bad news, Helen Willits in the weather studio. Helen.
Andrew, just remember, please don't blame the messenger for this one. Yeah, it is really treacherous out there, you're absolutely right. Still, we have an amber warning from the Met Office for the snow and ice for the rest of today across southern and western parts of England and parts of Wales as well. It is coming down thick and fast, that snow. You can see it here, actually. This is all snow. So showers across northeastern areas. This is the band of snow that's making its way gradually westwards. So coming into the sunny parts of Cornwall and Devon in the next hour or two and just continuing to fall. We've had reports of 7 or 8 inches of snow for parts of southeast Wales. That's 15 centimetres or more. We could see up to 20, and it's a very slow moving feature. Fewer showers this afternoon, certainly so for southern eastern areas, but they keep packing in the north and the east. Best sunshine northwestern parts of Northern Ireland, western Scotland, but again it is bitterly cold. 1 or 2 degrees for many of us above freezing and icy. Add on that strong near gale force wind, and clearly the wind chill will make it feel even more bitter. Now, as we go through this evening and overnight, still we have that issue with snow across southern and western areas. Really a bleak day here. Some absolutely horrendous conditions, particularly as the snow's blowing around in that strong wind, which does start to ease in the north. So widespread frost again, no change there. Very icy to start our Monday morning rush hour. But with high pressure starting to descend southwards, it cuts off the easterly wind. It allows us a northerly wind. Again, it's not a particularly warm direction, but we cut off the very, very cold air. Temperatures will recover a little tomorrow, and it's more ice rather than snow that we're concerned with for tomorrow. Andrew, some treacherous conditions out and about for the rest of today.
I'm glad I've decided to go for a nice walk in the country tomorrow. Now, in the Commons this week, Jeremy Corbyn warned Theresa May not to rush to judgment over who was behind the Salisbury nerve agent attack. Much of the press, the Conservative Party and a fair chunk of his own backbenchers promptly rushed to jump all over him as a Russian appeaser. But is that fair? After all, he was on the unpopular side of the argument in Parliament when it came to Iraq and Libya, and he feels he was proved right. Shami Chakrabarti, the Shadow Attorney General, is with me now. Thanks very much.
Good morning.
Good morning. Can I start by asking you very clearly, do you think that Vladimir Putin's government was responsible for what happened in Salisbury?
What I think is what Theresa May has said, which is that there's a responsibility of the regime, either in relation to having lost control of this chemical weaponry, or it's even more serious and it's a malevolent directed attack. And that's an important distinction going forward, because you're not going to get cooperation from a state that has deliberately targeted you, but you might get cooperation even from a slightly embarrassed state that has lost control of its stocks of chemical weapons. And I think that's an important distinction, and that's the distinction that Jeremy was making, but it's also a distinction that Theresa May has made herself.
So to be absolutely clear, when Boris Johnson says it's overwhelmingly likely that it was Putin himself and other states have agreed with him, you don't agree with that?
If Mr Johnson is saying that, he must be saying that on the basis of new evidence that, that Mrs May has not yet spoken about.
So at the moment, so far as you're concerned, it is not absolutely clear that this was directed by the Kremlin.
That's my understanding. It's either a loss of control, which, by the way, is pretty serious, including under the International Chemical Weapons Convention, and needs to be sorted out if that's the issue, or it is what the Foreign Secretary is suggesting. But if he is suggesting that, that would be on the basis of new evidence that's not been shared with Jeremy Corbyn, and it's not what Mrs May has said to date. Because
a lot of the world seems to have taken the same view. I mean, France, the United States, Germany have all said that they think it was Putin who was responsible for this.
Have they really, though, said it's Mr Putin directly, individually?
So the Russian state.
Yeah, but that's my point. I think, you know, you said to me earlier we need to be forensic about this, and I think we do. The Russian state is responsible for its stocks of chemical weapons, or historic stocks of chemical weapons from there. You're responsible whether you lose control or whether you personally direct extrajudicial killings.
But they're very, very different, of course.
Indeed, but you're responsible in any event. But what kind of culpability and what kind of responsibility is it? That's important.
Absolutely. So if you are not yet sure that it was the Russian state doing this themselves, why were you supporting the expulsion of 23 diplomats?
Because it's a proportionate escalation. It's part of the diplomatic dance, if you like, even if you're trying to get cooperation for a criminal investigation going forwards. But I think that Jeremy was right to support that proportionate escalation, but also to say it will be a tit for tat. There'll be a tit.
Is it?
I think it is, because diplomacy, you know, has an element of protocol and dancing within it. But the crucial thing is to go further now, and that is John McDonnell's suite of economic measures. And also, I think, and I'm here to say, also to pursue the Chemical Weapons Convention, and potentially to ask for inspections, challenge inspections, and, if necessary, further action at the international level.
Let's look at the alternative theory, which is that this material leaked out or was sold during the dissolution of the Soviet Union from some Russian facility and was acquired by some kind of mafia gang or other group of some kind. Have you any evidence that that happened at all?
All that we have is what we've been told, or what my Privy Councillor colleagues like Jeremy have been told by the government. And what we have been told is what Mrs May has said. She's outlined the two possibilities. That is the directed attack from the Kremlin or the loss of control. And all we have done...
This appears to be entirely supposition at this stage.
We are just repeating what we have been told because, of course, we're not in government. But we're just repeating what has been shared with us in security briefings and what Mrs May has said.
We seem to be into a sort of tit-for-tat process now. They've expelled 23 of our diplomats and closed down the British Consulate in St Petersburg, and we are then going to respond to that. How concerned are you about where we are going in this crisis?
I would personally caution against much more tit-for-tat in that way. I actually agree with Jane Moore, something she said earlier, which is, isn't it important to go, for example, for economic measures that apply not just to Russians, but to apply to dirty money and non-tax-paying money, regardless of the nationality of those involved.
Quite a lot of your colleagues are not happy, at least with the tone of what Jeremy Corbyn said. Neil Griffith has said, the defence spokesperson, has said that Russia was definitely responsible. Sir Keir Starmer has said there should be no ifs nor buts, Russia should be called out.
And I agree with all of that. And by the way, you know, Neil Griffith sent me a good luck text before I came on here, so there is no difference between us. Russia is, I repeat, Russia is looking responsible, whether it's negligent responsibility in not keeping control of these weapons or whether this is an extrajudicial killing and attack. But the distinction between the two types of Russian responsibility is still important going forward.
A lot of Labour MPs who are concerned enough to put down motions and so forth. Your colleague Chris Williamson has called them enemies and said they should be deselected. This sort of culture war inside the Labour Party is bubbling up on this issue. Are you at all concerned that this is the moment when the cracks could start to become unbridgeable?
No, and I am here to make clear that I am completely at one, not just with Jeremy, but with Neil Griffith, Emily Thornberry, Keir Starmer. We must condemn Russian responsibility, whether it is negligent or whether it is even more serious. But in order to be safer and in order to take control of these chemical weapons and to eliminate them from the world, you do need to make a distinction between negligence and taking back control and something that could be even more serious, which is directed attacks against people on our territory.
Quite a lot of your colleagues look at Jeremy Corbyn's office and they see Seamus Milne and what he has said about Russia in the past, and they see Andrew Murray, who has arrived from the Communist Party quite recently, and they just don't feel that he is speaking for them.
Well, I think people shouldn't be directing attacks on staffers. It's kind of not fair to pick on people who can't sort of speak for themselves. Jeremy is the leader of our party, but he also has a very strong team of shadow cabinet colleagues, some of whom you've cited, and we are all at one in the approach that I have just outlined.
So when it comes to people like the father-in-law of the police officer who was poisoned in Salisbury, who said that he found Mr Corbyn was mealy-mouthed and disappointing when it came to Russia. What do you say to, as it were, people outside the bubble who are looking in from the outside and just not quite sure about the tone?
Well, look, I think that the tone is also spun, whether it's Jeremy Corbyn's tone, which I think has been robust but also appropriately measured, or whether it's the Defence Secretary who one minute does talk about proportionality but then says shut up and go away. This is a very febrile moment, and I think people's words do get spun by the media and so on. That's understandable. I'm not going ballistic about that. But obviously people are concerned, people are worried, and that's why there's a responsibility on all of us to try and get our tone right.
Do you trust our intelligence services on this?
I do.
So there's no need, therefore, to send the Russians evidence of the nerve agent used. We can accept their word that it was Novichok.
No. Here's the thing about sending agents beyond this country, either possibly to the Russians if they're asking for it, or to
the organisation that prevent.
The reason for doing that is because it's the protocol of the convention, and I believe in pursuing these investigations under international law, because that's how you garner the broadest international coalition to get support going forward.
Do you think in the last couple of days there has been a McCarthyite atmosphere in this country?
I don't want to make things worse. I want to make things better. So I'm not going to escalate my language at this point, if you'll forgive me.
OK, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn suggested there was a sort of McCarthyism about, and certainly he has had a lot of abuse hurled at him over this.
He has had a lot of abuse hurled at him for a very long time, and I try to learn from his dignity under fire.
There is reports today of a new group of Labour MPs called Start Again or something, which is a kind of centrist, pro-European group who are very exercised about this issue and about others. Are you at all concerned that we are heading towards a position where the Labour Party might split?
I'm not too concerned. People have always had their democratic prerogative to experiment with new parties, and there's been talk in the Westminster bubble.
It's gone on and on, and it's never happened. But at some point, it might.
Well, there've been in past decades there've been experiments in new parties, but the Labour Party is a very fine and broad coalition. And I actually think it represents the new moderation in British politics, like taking on dirty money, like protecting people's jobs and services. I think that I'm a moderate and pretty much always have been.
All right, Chami Chakrabarti, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Coming up a little later, the Sunday Politics with Sarah Smith, who's going to be discussing Russia with the Foreign Office Minister, Sir Alan Duncan. And she'll also be joined by Labour's Yvette Cooper, Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee. That is the Sunday Politics here on BBC One at 11 o'clock. So far, the Russian response to Theresa May's expulsion of Russian personnel has been relatively cautious and proportional, but it's come alongside quite a lot of brutal mockery of Britain from official Kremlin outlets. Senior Russian spokesmen have by and large kept off the airways, but I was able to catch up with Mr. Putin's ambassador to the European Union, Vladimir Chitschov, in Brussels this week. Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, and other NATO allies have all said that Russia was responsible for the nerve attack in Salisbury. Were you?
Highly likely, they said. Russia, and I can assure you, without using the phraseology like highly likely, which has become very popular these days, Russia had nothing to do with it.
Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, has gone even further, and he said that it is very, very likely that Vladimir Putin himself ordered this attack.
Well, that rests with the responsibility of Boris Johnson, who I believe is acting in an inappropriate manner, which doesn't give him credit.
This was an attack on a man widely regarded in Russia as a traitor, using a chemical agent regarded as being made in Russia. And that is why many people in Britain say it is overwhelmingly likely the Russians must have been responsible. And if not the Russians, who?
Well, this whole case is based on assumptions, based on suspicions fueled by emotions. You rightly referred to Mr. Skripal as a traitor, as a defector, but, I can assure you that he is almost forgotten in Russia. He has been living in Britain for 8 years now. Before that, I think I should stress the point, he was officially pardoned by a presidential decree, which means that whatever one can think of him in the moral sense, But from the legal point of view, the Russian state had nothing against him. And also, I should add, his daughter, Yulia, is a Russian citizen. That's why among the many violations by the British authorities in this case, I will cite that it is a blatant violation of the bilateral consular convention by not allowing Russian diplomats and consular officials access to a Russian citizen currently in hospital.
And the Russian state has now announced criminal investigations into the attempted murder of Yulia Kripal and indeed Mr. Glushkov as well. Can I ask, as part of that investigation, whether Russian authorities will be seeking access to the nerve agent and to the police who are involved in the case?
Certainly, the Russian investigative committee will request cooperation from the British authorities according to international law and existing bilateral agreements. Actually, the Russian side, through the embassy in London, requested access to evidence, if any, if there is any, to the nerve agent from the very beginning, from the first day, but was flatly refused. In spite of that being Britain's obligation on the basis of the International Convention on Prohibition of Chemical Weapons.
This is a very obscure nerve agent, not much understood around the world. Has Russia ever produced this agent, Novichok?
No.
Never?
No. Actually, Russia has stopped production of any chemical agents back in 1992. So you cannot even talk about any chemical agents produced by Russia. All that had been produced previously was produced by the Soviet Union. In 1992, the then President Boris Yeltsin signed a decree stopping all production, and according to the International Convention on Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, last year in 2017, Russia destroyed all its stockpiles. There is only one country today which hasn't done so, which is still retaining its chemical stockpiles, and that is the United States of America.
Can I be absolutely clear then, Russia has no stockpiles of any nerve agents whatever?
Indeed, no stockpiles whatsoever.
So then there is the question, how did this agent come to be used in Salisbury? It has been suggested, for instance, that during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, some of this agent may have been stolen or sold and ended up in the hands of either criminal gangs or other state parties. What's your view?
Well, why don't you ask yourself the question, how come the British authorities so quickly managed to designate the nerve agent used as something called Novichok? It can only mean that they had a standard...
It has a signature, I think. It has a chemical signature that they were able to...
But when you have a nerve agent or whatever, you check it against certain samples that you retain in your laboratories. And Porton Down, as we now all know, is the largest military facility in the United Kingdom that has been dealing with chemical weapons research. And it's actually only 8 miles from Salisbury.
You're not suggesting that Porton Down is responsible for this nerve agent?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't have any evidence of anything having been used. And of course, I should add perhaps that I exclude the possibility of any stockpiles of any chemical weapons fleeing Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
You don't think
there were certain specialists, including scientists who today claim to have been responsible for creating some nerve agent that have been whisked out of Russia and are currently residing in the United Kingdom.
So they defected. They said it was made and that it was tested in Uzbekistan, for instance, and that therefore it was around and could have been stolen, could have been sold on.
I will not comment on their words, but they were involved in certain research of various chemical weapons, yes,
okay.
In the Soviet years.
In her response, first response, Theresa May has expelled 23 Russian citizens. Were they spies?
Of course not. They were diplomats.
Are there any Russian spies in Britain?
Come on. You're not asking the right person, perhaps. Are there any British spies in Russia?
One of the other possibilities that Britain has talked about is the use of the so-called Magnitsky Act to freeze the assets of various people who've been using London to wash money through London, individuals. In some respects, I would imagine you would welcome that.
Well, I wouldn't care about the fate of money being laundered in London, be it Russian or of any other origin.
And what about the suggestion that members of the royal family and politicians and so forth won't come to Russia for the World Cup? The World Cup was going to be a very, very big moment for modern Russia. Is this a blow to Russia?
Well, I'm sure that those members of the royal family who had been planning to come will be sorry hearing that from their own government.
It's been a very difficult time in relations between Russia and Britain. There's been a whole series of issues, alleged Russian involvement in elections in Europe and America and Britain as well, lots of tensions over the Baltic states and Ukraine and so forth. Looking ahead, what do you see for Britain's relationship with Russia after we've left the EU?
Well, you know, at one point I said to a British colleague of mine that I was actually looking into a bright future of Russian-British relations after Brexit, because Britain was no longer be confined by EU sanctions or anything like that. Somehow he didn't support that view.
I mean, at this period, there is almost universal anger about British-Russian relationships in Britain at the moment. Gavin Williamson...
And in Russia too.
And in Russia too. Gavin Williamson, our new defence secretary, said recently that Russia is going to be thinking, how can we cause so much pain in Britain, damage its economy, rip its infrastructure apart, cause thousands and thousands of deaths, and create total chaos within the UK? That is the perspective of a senior British minister about your country now.
Well, he also said, if I remember correctly, the wording that Russia should shut up and go away. Let me assure that Russia is not going to shut up and will certainly not go away.
There has been a sort of sense in Britain that Russia was almost mocking us about this terrible attack. Some of your presenters have talked about the British climate being very unhealthy for Russian defectors and people falling out of buildings, and even your president has talked about traitors eating poison and so forth. Almost as if people in Moscow regard this as a funny matter.
It certainly is not a funny matter, and actually the latest news that I heard from Moscow referred to the launch of 2 criminal investigations by the Russian Investigative Committee on damage to the health of a Russian citizen, Ms. Yulia Skripal, and the unexplained mysterious death of Mr. Nikolai Glushkov.
And to be absolutely clear, Russian investigators will come to British police shortly and say, we want access to this investigation, we want to work alongside you when it comes to what happened in Salisbury, and we would like to see the nerve agent used, and we would like proper access.
Of course they will, first through correspondence, then perhaps should a personal visit be required, then they will come. And actually, Russia has offered to cooperate on the Salisbury incident from the very outset, but we didn't get any answer whatsoever from the Foreign Office or any other government agency.
Well, listening to that is the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson. Welcome, Mr. Johnson. We have to be very clear and very careful, of course, about this, the evidence in this very serious matter. So you have said it's overwhelmingly likely that Vladimir Putin was responsible. You saw the ambassador brush that aside. Why do you say that?
Well, we gave the Russians a very clear choice, and the Prime Minister said on Monday, as I said to the Russian ambassador to the UK, you know, either help us to understand how the stockpiles of Novichok have gone missing and how some of it could have turned up on the streets of Wiltshire in this way, or else I'm afraid we will be forced, as the Prime Minister said in the House of Commons, to draw the conclusion, as we did in the case of Alexander Litvinenko, that the trail of culpability leads inexorably to the Kremlin. And I think listening to the Russian response, listening again to the response of the Russian ambassador to the EU with his satirical suggestion that this was done by UK agents from Porton Down. This is not the response of a country that really believes itself to be innocent. This is not the response of a country that really wants to engage in getting to the bottom of the matter.
The Prime Minister told the House of Commons there were two possible explanations of this. Either this was a deliberate attack by the Russian state, or else the Novichok had come out and become and got into the hands of criminal gangs. You seem to be excluding the latter possibility now.
We gave the Russians every opportunity to come up with an alternative hypothesis such as the one that you have just described, and they haven't. And their response has been a sort of mixture of smug sarcasm and denial, obfuscation and delay. So what we are doing on the Novichok and on the nerve agent, what we will do is tomorrow, technical experts from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons will come from The Hague to the UK. We will share the samples with them. They will then be tested by the most reputable possible international laboratories. And I might just say, in response to Mr. Chizov's point about Russian stockpiles of chemical weapons, we actually have evidence within the last 10 years that Russia has not only been investigating the delivery of nerve agents for the purposes of assassination, but has also been creating and stockpiling Novichok.
So that was a direct lie that I was being given there.
But you will get that, and that is exactly the tactics that we've come to expect from Russia over the last few years. And one of the things that has really struck me in the course of the last few days, as we've been talking to friends and colleagues around the world, is the difference between their reaction this time and their reaction to the death of Alexander Litvinenko. And then back in 2006, there was much more hesitation, much more people saying, well, perhaps it could be rogue elements of the Russian state and so on and so forth. Now you have people such as Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to the UN, with her very, very powerful denunciation of Russia. My colleague Jacek Kapuscinski on Friday in London, pointing the finger squarely at Russia. And I think what that indicates is the change in people's attitudes towards Russia because of the experience of the last 10 years.
Is it change in attitudes, their attitude to us? They don't really care anymore what we do or say.
I think that it's obvious that they do care, and I think that is one of the reasons why the UK is, as it were, in the Kremlin's crosshairs, because they look at us and they think this is the country that time and again has called Russia out, has stood up to Russia when it comes to Crimea, to what they've been doing in Syria. And just to get back to the point I was making just now about the international response.
I want to ask you about. Are you absolutely sure it's this mysterious thing called Novichok? We talk about it all the time now. We all assume that it's that. How are we sure?
Well, I obviously, to the best of our knowledge, this is a Russian-made nerve agent that falls within the category Novichok, made only by Russia. And just to get back to the point about the international reaction, which is so fascinating, people have all now experienced, whether it's in America, Germany, France, say nothing of the Baltic countries, the Balkans and Poland, they've all experienced Russian meddling, malign, disruptive Russian behaviour over the last few years. They can see a country that is going in the wrong direction. And that's why they're so inclined now to not to give Russia the benefit of the doubt and to stand shoulder to shoulder with the UK.
Do you think, given that background, that 2% is enough for our defence spending? An awful lot of your colleagues, including Tobias Ellwood, Defence Minister, it's no longer enough. What's happened to the dollar, but also the threats that we now face from the East, that we do need to protect ourselves better as a country than we have been doing, and we need to spend more money.
Well, we are one of the biggest spenders on defence in NATO, as you know, where we contribute about 20% of European defence spending already, and it's quite right that we should spend well on our defences. And
my question is, should we be spending more than we are targeted to at the moment?
We must make sure that we are adequately and properly defended, and certainly that is a case that I make, and I know other
the Chancellor and
other ministers certainly have been making that case. But when it comes to the defences of this country, we are also ensuring that we're protected against cyber attack and attacks on our critical national infrastructure and other such threats.
We read today that there has been increased worry about attacks on the infrastructure, electricity supply, nuclear power stations, water and so forth. Is that something the government is worried about at the moment?
Well, as I say, it's something, obviously, it's a threat that has changed over the last few years because cyber attacks are a relatively new development, but we have the National Cyber Security Centre. We have fantastic preparations against such threats.
You'll have heard the ambassador talking about Nikolai Glushkov. Do you think the death of Mr. Glushkov is connected to this affair?
That's a matter for the police, and they have to get on with their investigation. I have no evidence of any connection.
Now, the ambassador also said that the Russians are prosecuting the deaths of the daughter, Mr. Kripal, and Mr. Glushkov, because they're both Russian citizens, and that their people will be arriving here and talking to our police, looking for cooperation. Will they get cooperation?
We have wanted cooperation from the Russians in this matter for some days, and we've been greeted with a lot of sarcasm and I think plainly an attitude of a country that is guilty of this matter. If we can genuinely be of assistance to the Russians in getting to the bottom of what has happened, then we will do that. I rather doubt whether they are entirely serious in what they are doing.
Okay, but if Russian investigators arrive in London and say, we're interested in the attack on Yulia and the death of Mr. Glushkov, we would like to work alongside the British police and have access to the investigation that we're conducting, they will be given that.
We will do everything we can to assist in getting to the bottom of what has happened. Whether it is appropriate to have Russian investigators on UK soil engaged in trying to get to the bottom, I somewhat doubt. But what we will certainly do, as I said earlier,
we will help as far as we can.
What we will do is we will ensure that, and this is I'm afraid the ambassador was completely misleading about the UK's obligations under the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. We have followed those obligations to the letter. And what we will be doing now is getting the samples and making sure that they are available to the technical experts to allow them to elucidate exactly what they are. And I think you would agree. I think you would agree that they are a rather more reliable, and I think the British people have much more confidence in what they do than in any Russian investigation.
Let's move on to what happens next. We kicked out 23 of their people we regard as spies. They've kicked out 23 of ours. Tit for tat, is that?
Well, there is a normal symmetry in these diplomatic affairs, and you would expect that. Look, you've got to understand...
Is it going to go further than that symmetry, is what I'm asking, really?
We will discuss at the National Security Council this week what further measures, if any, we may want to take. But I would just stress this, that the UK is already pursuing a number of measures. Hardening our borders. Of course, we're pursuing the diplomatic expulsions.
Let me ask you about money.
But we are also going to be using the tools that are available to us under existing statute to pursue those who may have corruptly obtained their wealth. We will be going further with what is called a Magnitsky clause in the sanctions bill, and so all these things are moving forward at the same time. 2 weeks ago,
the Labour Party put down Magnitsky Act amendments, and the Conservatives voted against them. Why was that?
Well, there were deficiencies in the way those amendments were drafted, which didn't make them suitable. But we are working to get provisions that will allow those who have been responsible for gross violations of human rights to be prosecuted and not to be able to come to this country.
To be absolutely clear, you are going to, as a government, you're going to go after named individuals who have in the past been able to wash their money through London, invest in housing and so forth, and you're going to grab their money.
Well, we live in a democracy under the rule of law. It's not open to me, as a politician in this country, to direct the law enforcement agencies to go after such and such a person. That's what they do in Russia. What we have said, and what we have statute now since April last year under the Criminal Finance Act to do this. We have said that where people have obtained wealth by corruption, and where we can see a link with the Kremlin, with Vladimir Putin, it may be possible to have unexplained wealth orders and other sanctions on those individuals. And that work is going on now, and it will be intensifying. But you would not expect me. You would not expect me to reveal the names.
Labour says that part of the Conservative hesitation in this is that you, as a party, have been taking far too much Russian money for far too long. And there's the case of the lady Lyubov Chernukin, who paid £160,000 to have a game of tennis with you.
Yeah.
Did that game actually take place?
Can I just make a point about this whole anti?
You're going to say good Russians and bad Russians. I know that.
I am actually. I was
going to say back to you that this lady's husband was a minister of Vladimir Putin and was given an award by Vladimir Putin. So he was close to the regime. And you, as a party, were prepared to take £160,000 from her so that she could have a game of tennis with Boris Johnson.
Well, if there is evidence of gross corruption in the way that gentleman you mentioned obtained his wealth, then it is well within the. It is possible for our law enforcement agencies to deprive him of his wealth with an unexplained wealth order. That is a matter for the authorities. It's not a matter for me, and it is very, very important now because I'm getting a lot of people emailing me from Russia who feel that they feel that Russians. It's very, very important that we stress.
I agree with that, sir, but
the Russians themselves are in no way the object of our wrath.
I accept that. I just want to pursue this particular case, if I may.
We have no quarrel with the Russian people.
Did the tennis game actually happen?
It did.
It did. Are you happy that the same lady, and again, do you know enough about the origins of that money? And she has now paid £30,000 to sit next to the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, and have dinner with him. Are you happy about that?
Look, unless and until evidence is produced against individual Russians, I do not think that the entire nation should be conundrified.
It's a difficult balance. I absolutely agree with that. But
it is very, very important. There are many Russians who have come to this country and made their lives here and contributed magnificently to our culture and our society. And they feel threatened.
Traduced. I understand that. But on the other hand,
it is very important.
Let me remind you what Marina Litvinenko, the widow of Mr. Litvinenko, Sasha, said. She said, Theresa May and the Conservatives need to be very selective who you're friends with. When you allow people with money to come to your country and make a business, you need to be sure what kind of money these people try to bring to your country. Because very often, she said, it had come about inappropriately. All I'm saying is it's very difficult to know exactly the source of the money that you take.
Well, that's why we have the National Crime Agency, that's why we have the National Economic Crime Unit. That's what they are there to do. They are there to get to the bottom of whether somebody's wealth has been obtained corruptly or not. But really and truly, it is very important that we do not allow a miasma of suspicion about all Russians in London, and indeed all rich Russians in London, to be created. Some of them, some of them may have obtained their wealth by corruption. And I have to say, I think it is quite extraordinary at a time when you have two people lying gravely ill in hospital in Salisbury, when a police officer is still is still not out of hospital, for the fire somehow to be turned on Conservative Party funding. As far to the best of my knowledge, all possible checks have been made, and they will continue to be made.
You'll have seen the story this morning about Cambridge Analytica, this data collection company, in trouble for harvesting information from Facebook and then using it to target potential voters. They were involved in the Brexit referendum and the American elections as well.
Yeah,
they've been summoned back to the House of Commons. Do you think there should be a proper investigation into this?
I've got to be honest with you, Andrew, it's not something I've focused on.
Well, let's move to something you have focused on, I'm sure.
But I'm sure if there are, if again, I mean, the general point can be made. If there's some crime or then I'm sure that the law must follow its course.
The Brexit Select Committee has suggested that we may have to delay the triggering of Article 50 because we're not ready. What's your response?
Well, I don't think that's true at all, and I think that we're making great progress in the negotiations, and I hope that we'll get a good deal on the implementation period in March. And I think the House of Commons voted overwhelmingly to to trigger Article 50 and let's get on with it.
There's another report today, however, saying that our border arrangements simply won't be ready in time. We need more time to do this. Are you concerned that the thing is going to slip?
No, I think we can. I think what most people in this country want, whether they voted leave or to remain, they want us just to get on and do with it.
Why did you feel it necessary to write a letter to the Prime Minister saying that there might be a hard Irish border?
What I said, I don't wish to.
I've got the quote here. We can help you with the quote.
You can. What you have is, I'm afraid, only.
It is wrong to see our task as maintaining no border. Even if a hard border is reintroduced, we would expect 95% of goods to pass. So you use the phrase hard border twice, which is interesting because you are a member of a government which says there's not going to be a hard border.
The whole point about the letter was to say we don't need a hard border, OK? And that's the policy of the government, and that's what we're going to produce. And if you read the Prime Minister's Mansion House speech, which was excellent, you will have seen. You will have seen that she produced a number of solutions for the avoidance of a hard border, and that was what I was advocating, and that was if you had the entire document, it would be very clear.
You said you were going to publish the letter. When are you going to do that?
Well, we do not. It is up to the media organisations that leaked a part of it. If they choose to,
you said you would publish it.
Well, it turns out that
you've changed your mind.
We do not, as a matter of course, respond to leaks by putting the whole thing into the public domain. But I can assure you that the letter said the exact opposite of what you have just claimed it said.
Well, I've just read a bit of it. So,
I know.
These are words, and
yes, I know,
words mean things and so forth.
And they don't, as it happens, mean what you want them to mean.
It is wrong to see our task as maintaining no border. The government's only aim should be stop this border becoming significantly harder, even if a hard border is reintroduced, you say, and then you go on.
Well,
well, let me read it. Publish it.
What I was saying is very clearly in line with what the government as a whole has been saying for a long time, which is there is no need to have a hard border. There are ways of avoiding it, as the Prime Minister said in her excellent Mansion House speech, and I suggest that you quote that and read that and put that.
Okay, I'm going to quote something back at you as well. Do you think that Russia intervened in the Brexit referendum?
I have no evidence for that.
You've said in the past you didn't think they successfully intervened, but you have no evidence that they intervened at all.
I certainly have no evidence that they successfully intervened, no.
Certainly not. OK,
no.
One last Brexit-related question, then we can move on. We haven't spoken for a little while. As one of the great cheerleaders for Brexit, when you look at what's happening now, when you look at the fact that the European Court will have some influence on us after we leave, when you look at the fact that we're going to be paying money in to be members of some agencies, and you look at the timescale of all of this, are you completely cheerful that it has turned out as you wanted it to do?
I think we've got ourselves into. I do. I think that the Mansion House speech was a great step forward, and I think it shows exactly the type of deal we want to get. We're not going to have the influence of the European Court of Justice. We're not. I don't know why you're saying all this sort of BBC claptrap.
No,
we're not going to be paying in. We're not going to be paying in.
If it's claptrap, it's the Prime Minister's claptrap.
We're not going to be paying in. We're not going to be paying in after we come out. Yes, there will be an implementation period, but after we come out, we'll have what is effectively a gigantic free trade deal with all sorts of bolt-ons. And the advantage of the new arrangements, as the Prime Minister spelt out at Mansion House, is that it will be possible for either side to do things differently, to do things in their own way, and
so
there will be an independent arbitration panel that will be able to decide whether. Can I just finish the point? So you just respect me.
Okay.
There will be an independent arbitration panel that will be able to decide whether or not there is a distortion of trade entailed. So we have, on money, on borders, on laws, you are seeing the fulfilment of the pledge to take back control.
We have also taken back. We have to take back control of the clock and the time because we have run out of time. Boris Johnson, for now. Thank you very much indeed. Now, look at what's coming up straight after this programme.
Join us at 10 from Brighton, where, with calls from across the political spectrum for a second Brexit vote, we ask whether the people should have the final say on the terms of the deal. And as the case of baby Alfie Evans is referred to the Supreme Court, should doctors have the ultimate decision on life-sustaining interventions? See you at 10 on BBC One.
Tragically and appallingly, we're out of time. So thanks to all my guests. Harold Wilson used to say that a week was a long time in politics. It feels like a lifetime just now. I have absolutely no idea what we'll have for you next week, but see you then.